They thought he was just another tired mechanic. They had no idea who they just messed with. Someone had been inside his home, near his daughter's things. That was the last mistake they'd ever make. He promised himself he'd left that life behind. But some men don't understand mercy until it's already gone. They crossed a line no father forgives. And now, there was no going back. He thought they were dealing with a quiet mechanic. They were about to learn exactly who he used to be.
If you have ever been underestimated, ever been looked down on because of what you drive, where you live, or how quiet you choose to be, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what happens to this single father will remind you that the quietest people are often carrying the loudest storms inside them. If this story moves you, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one again. Let's begin. Ethan Cole had learned, a long time ago, that the world rewards loud men and punishes quiet ones. He had learned it in the worst classroom imaginable, and he had learned it well enough to bury that old life completely, wrap it in silence, and become someone else. By the time this story starts, nobody in the small town of Millbrook knew that the soft-spoken mechanic who fixed their cars and picked up his 8-year-old daughter from school every day at 3:15 sharp had once been a man other men were trained to fear. His daughter's name was Lily. She had her mother's copper-colored hair and her father's steady hazel eyes, and she was, without question, the only thing that mattered to Ethan anymore. Her mother, Sarah, had died 3 years earlier in a car accident on a rain-slick highway, and since that night Ethan had rebuilt his entire existence around one single goal, making sure Lily never felt the ground disappear beneath her feet the way his had. He worked at Rossi's Auto Repair, a modest garage on the edge of town, 6 days a week, and every evening he came home, smelling of engine oil, and made her grilled cheese sandwiches cut into triangles because she said triangles tasted better than squares. He drove an old, dented pickup truck. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation. He never raised his voice, never bragged, never picked a fight. To the town of Millbrook, he was simply the quiet mechanic, a man so unremarkable that people forgot to be curious about him at all. That anonymity was exactly what he wanted. It was armor, and it worked. Right up until the day Marcus Doyle decided Ethan Cole looked like easy prey. Marcus Doyle ran a used car lot 2 streets over from Rossi's, and beneath the polished veneer of local businessman, he ran something else entirely. A network of loan sharking, insurance fraud, and quiet intimidation that had kept half the town in either afraid of him or in his pocket for years. Marcus had a way of smiling with his mouth while his eyes stayed cold, and he had built his fortune convincing struggling families to sign papers they didn't understand, then squeezing them for every cent when they inevitably fell behind. He drove a car that cost more than most houses in Millbrook, and he liked people to notice that. Marcus first noticed Ethan the way a predator notices a limp. Ethan had quietly disputed a bill from Marcus's dealership, a bogus repair charge tacked onto a used car Marcus had sold to one of Ethan's neighbors, an elderly widow named Mrs. Patterson who couldn't afford a lawyer and certainly couldn't afford to fight back. Ethan, without asking for credit, drove Mrs. Patterson to the dealership himself, sat across from Marcus with the same calm expression he wore while replacing brake pads, and simply said the charge would not be paid and that Marcus would return the difference in cash that afternoon. Marcus laughed. He genuinely laughed. The kind of laugh a man gives when someone he considers small dares to speak to him directly. He told Ethan to get out of his office before he called the police and had him arrested for harassment. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, thanked Marcus for his time, and walked Mrs. Patterson back to the truck. But something in the stillness of that exchange, the complete absence of fear in a man who by every visible measure should have been afraid, planted a small, uncomfortable seed in Marcus Doyle's mind. He didn't recognize it yet for what it was. He mistook it for arrogance. He decided, in that moment, that the quiet mechanic needed to be taught a lesson about who really ran this town. That lesson began small. A week later, Ethan's truck had all 4 tires slashed in the Rossi's parking lot, in broad daylight, with 2 of Marcus's men leaning against a nearby fence, making no effort at all to hide the fact that they had done it. The garage owner, Tony Rossi, a good man but a tired one, apologized to Ethan and quietly suggested he let the matter go. "Marcus Doyle owns half this town's debts, Ethan," Tony said. "You poke that hornet's nest, it doesn't just sting you, it stings everybody who works here." Ethan understood. He paid for new tires out of his own pocket and said nothing. And that night, lying awake long after Lily had fallen asleep, he found himself thinking about a different kind of silence entirely, the kind he had lived inside for 9 years before Millbrook ever existed for him. He thought about the desert heat that never truly left his skin even years later, about the specific weight of a rifle he had once carried the way other men carry a wallet, about the 2 friends he had buried in a ceremony so classified their own hometowns had been told only that they died in an accident overseas. He thought about the version of himself who had once believed that strength meant never backing down from anyone, and about the slower, harder lesson that came afterward, that real strength sometimes means swallowing an insult from a man like Marcus Doyle, because the cost of reacting would fall on people who couldn't afford it. He had left that old life because he was tired of being the answer to every hard question. He had wanted, more than anything, to build a life where the hardest question he faced each day was whether Lily wanted her sandwich cut into triangles or squares. Marcus Doyle, without any idea what he was doing, was slowly, carelessly, dragging that old life back into the light. But Marcus wasn't finished, because men like Marcus never mistake silence for peace. They mistake it for surrender, and surrender to them is an invitation to take more. 2 weeks after the tires, someone broke into Ethan's modest rental house while he was at work and Lily was at school. Nothing valuable was stolen. That was the point. Whoever did it wanted Ethan to know they could get inside his home, inside the one space in the world he had built specifically to keep his daughter safe. They left Lily's stuffed rabbit, her favorite, sitting neatly on the kitchen table where it did not belong, facing the front door, as if it had been arranged deliberately to be found. Ethan stood in that kitchen for 11 minutes without moving. Anyone who had known him in his old life would have recognized the specific, terrible quality of his stillness in that moment, the stillness of a man doing calculations, weighing exactly how far he was willing to go and what it would cost him. But nobody in Millbrook had known that man, and so nobody understood what they were truly waking up. Because before Ethan Cole became a mechanic in a small town, before he became a widowed father cutting sandwiches into triangles, he had spent 9 years as an operator in a specialized unit whose name never appeared in any newspaper and whose missions were classified for decades, if they were ever declassified at all. He had left that life voluntarily, after a mission that cost him 2 friends and very nearly his own life, choosing instead a slower, quieter kind of living, where the only thing he had to protect was one small girl with copper hair. He had promised himself he would never again be the man who solved problems with violence. He had kept that promise for 6 years. Marcus Doyle was about to become the reason that promise finally broke, not with rage, but with the cold, deliberate precision of a man who had simply run out of other options. There was a betrayal buried in all of this too, though Ethan wouldn't discover it until later, and it would hurt in a way the tires and the break-in never had. Tony Rossi's nephew, a young man named Danny Rossi, who worked the front desk at the garage, answering phones and scheduling appointments, had been quietly feeding Marcus's men information for months. Small things at first, which days Ethan worked late, which afternoons Lily stayed after school for art club, all in exchange for a few $100s here and there to cover gambling debts he was too ashamed to tell his uncle about. Danny hadn't known, or hadn't let himself know, what that information was actually being used for. He told himself it was harmless, that Marcus's people just wanted to keep tabs on a man who owed the boss money, a small lie that let him sleep at night. It was Danny, without ever intending real harm, who had confirmed Lily's school schedule to the men who later stood outside her bus stop. When Ethan eventually pieced this together through Daniel's research, the sense of betrayal cut deeper than anything Marcus himself had done, because Danny worked 20 feet from him every day, took his coffee order every morning, asked politely about Lily's school project the week before. Ethan never confronted him directly. He simply made sure, through a quiet word to Tony that never explained the real reason, that Danny found himself a new job in another town within the month, far from Marcus Doyle's reach, and far from the temptation that had nearly cost a little girl her safety. Some betrayals, Ethan had learned long ago, are better resolved than punished, especially when the person responsible is more weak than wicked. That night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table long after Lily had fallen asleep, staring at the stuffed rabbit, and made a decision that had nothing to do with revenge in the way most people imagine it. Revenge, to Ethan, was never about making someone suffer for the pleasure of it. It was about making a threat, permanently incapable of being a threat, again. He began, quietly, methodically, to remember skills he had spent years trying to forget. The next morning, he did something that surprised even himself. He went to see an old friend. His name was Daniel Reyes, a former teammate from his unit who now ran a small private security consulting firm 2 hours away, a man who had left the service around the same time Ethan had and who understood, better than anyone alive, exactly what kind of man Ethan used to be. Daniel had always told Ethan that if he ever needed anything, day or night, the door was open. Ethan drove those 2 hours in silence, dropped Lily at his sister's house for the weekend under the excuse of a work emergency, and sat across from Daniel in a small office that smelled like coffee and gun oil. "I need information," Ethan said, "on a man named Marcus Doyle, and I need it clean. No trace back to me." Daniel studied his old friend's face for a long moment. He had seen that expression exactly once before, years ago, in a country whose name they were both still forbidden to say aloud in polite company. "What did he do?" Daniel asked. "He came into my house," Ethan said, "near my daughter's things." Daniel didn't ask another question. He simply nodded, opened his laptop, and began to work. Over the following 2 weeks, a picture assembled itself, piece by piece, and it was far larger and far uglier than Ethan had expected. Marcus Doyle wasn't just a bully with a car lot. He was laundering money through a network of shell companies registered to the dealership, funneling profits from an illegal lending operation that had, over the past 8 years, driven at least 11 families in 3 counties into bankruptcy, foreclosure, or worse. One elderly man, a widower named Harold Finch, had taken his own life after Marcus's Wediz collectors threatened to have his disabled granddaughters Wediz medical equipment repossessed over a loan he could no longer service. Marcus had covered it up completely, framing it as unrelated personal tragedy, and continued operating without a hint of consequence. The town's local sheriff's deputy, a heavyset man named Rick Delgado, had been quietly taking payments from Marcus for years to look the other way. This was, Ethan realized, no longer about tire slashings or intimidation. This was about a man who had been allowed, through fear and corruption, to destroy lives for nearly a decade without anyone ever standing in his way. And Ethan understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had once been trained to see, exactly this kind of pattern, that if he simply beat Marcus Doyle in a parking lot, nothing would change. Marcus would heal, hire more muscle, and the town would remain exactly as broken as before. The only real revenge, the only revenge that actually meant anything, was the kind that permanently removed a predator's teeth and gave his victims the power to fight back themselves. So Ethan built a different kind of trap. He spent 3 weeks quietly gathering everything Daniel could pull together, cross-referencing it with public records, property filings, and, carefully, anonymously, statements from people Marcus had wronged, people who had been too afraid to speak until someone showed them their fear no longer needed to control them. Ethan visited Mrs. Patterson first, told her nothing about his old life, only that he believed Marcus could finally be stopped and that her story mattered. He visited Harold Finch's daughter, a woman named Claire who had spent 2 years grieving her father in silence, convinced no one would ever care enough to listen. He visited 3 other families, one by one, in the quiet, unhurried way he did everything. And slowly, without threats, without violence, he began building something Marcus Doyle had never anticipated, a coalition of people who were no longer afraid. But Marcus, sensing something shifting in the town's atmosphere, sensing that the quiet mechanic he had underestimated was somehow still standing, still calm, still unbroken despite everything thrown at him, decided to escalate one final time, and it was this final escalation that would cost him everything. On a Thursday afternoon, while Ethan was at work, two of Marcus's men followed the school bus and waited near the pickup line where Lily usually got off. They did nothing illegal. Technically, they simply stood there, watching, letting themselves be seen by Ethan's neighbor who happened to be picking up her own child that day and who called Ethan immediately, her voice shaking. Ethan left the garage without a word to anyone, drove to the school in 11 minutes flat, and arrived just as Lily was stepping off the bus, safe. Confused, but safe. That night, after Lily was finally asleep, having been distracted with a movie and reassured everything was fine, Ethan called Daniel and said 4 words that set the entire final phase of his plan into motion. It's time to move. The plan Ethan and Daniel executed over the following 10 days was not the kind of revenge anyone watching from the outside would recognize as revenge at all, and that was precisely its power. There was no violence. There was no confrontation in a dark alley. No fists. No threats whispered through gritted teeth. Instead, Ethan and Daniel worked with a federal financial crimes contact Daniel had maintained relationships with since their service days, quietly compiling the evidence of Marcus's laundering operation into a package so complete, so meticulously documented, that no lawyer on earth could argue it away. They handed it, anonymously, to the right investigator, a woman named Agent Priya Anand, who had been building a much larger case against a regional loan sharking network for over a year, and had been missing exactly the piece of evidence Ethan now handed her. Agent Anand had spent 14 months watching promising leads collapse under the weight of frightened witnesses who withdrew their statements the moment Marcus's woes men made a single phone call, and she had begun to privately doubt whether the case would ever move past internal memos and closed-door frustration. When the anonymous package arrived, meticulously organized, cross-referenced with bank routing numbers, shell company filings, and dates that lined up with almost surgical precision against her own partial timeline, she read through it twice in one sitting, then called her supervisor at 11 o'clock at night to say the case had just changed entirely. She never learned who sent it. She assumed, reasonably, that it had come from someone deep inside Marcus's own organization, a disgruntled accountant or a nervous associate looking for a plea deal, and she spent weeks quietly trying to identify that source, never once suspecting a mechanic in a flannel shirt 2 counties away. At the same time, Ethan reached out, this time openly, under his own name, to a local journalist named Beth Okafor, who had spent years trying and failing to get anyone in Millbrook to speak on a record against Marcus Doyle. Ethan connected her with Claire Finch, with Mrs. Patterson, with the 3 other families, all of whom, emboldened by each other and by Ethan's steady, unthreatening presence, finally agreed to go on record. Beth's story, when it published 2 weeks later, did not name Ethan even once. It didn't need to. It laid out, in devastating detail, the human cost of Marcus Doyle's decade of predation, timed to break just as federal agents executed a search warrant on his dealership and froze every count connected to his shell companies. Marcus Doyle was arrested on a Tuesday morning, in front of his own dealership, in front of the very customers he had spent years exploiting. Deputy Rick Delgado, cornered by the scale of the evidence and desperate to save himself, turned state's witness within 48 hours, confirming years of payoffs, and confirming, devastatingly, Marcus's role in the pressure campaign that preceded Harold Finch's death. What had once seemed like an untouchable local kingpin collapsed in the span of 9 days into a man facing decades in federal prison, his assets seized, his name permanently attached to the very families he had destroyed. Ethan watched all of it from a careful distance, never once stepping into the light himself, never once needing anyone to know what he had done. He didn't need Marcus to know it was him. He didn't need the town to celebrate him as a hero. He had learned, in his old life, that the most effective kind of justice asks for no recognition, only results. His revenge wasn't a fist. It was a system, quietly assembled by a quiet man, aimed with total precision at the exact thing that had let a predator survive for so long: the silence of people too afraid to speak. In the weeks that followed, something began to shift in Millbrook that had nothing to do with Marcus Doyle at all. Mrs. Patterson, freed from the weight of a debt she had spent 2 years terrified of, started a small community fund to help other elderly residents facing predatory contracts, and asked Ethan, gently, if he might help her figure out the paperwork. Claire Finch, for the first time since her father's death, began speaking publicly about predatory lending and financial abuse of the elderly, testifying before a state consumer protection panel, her voice steady in a way it hadn't been in years. Tony Rossi, who had once quietly urged Ethan to let things go, instead began referring customers he suspected were being taken advantage of directly to Ethan, trusting him now in a way that went beyond mechanics and engine oil. And Ethan himself, without ever intending it, without ever wanting the attention, became something the town hadn't had in a long time, a person people trusted completely, precisely because he had never once asked for that trust. Nobody knew the full extent of what he had done. Most assumed the investigation had simply been building on its own, that Beth Okafor had done good journalism, that federal agents had finally caught up to a corrupt local businessman through ordinary diligence. Only Daniel knew the whole truth, and Daniel, true to the code they had both lived by for years, never spoke a word of it to anyone. Even Danny Rossi, 3 towns away in his new job, eventually heard about Marcus Doyle's arrest on the local news, and sat alone in his apartment for a long time afterward, understanding, finally and completely, exactly what he had almost been a part of. He never learned that Ethan had known about him, never learned that the quiet mechanic had chosen mercy over exposure. He simply carried the weight of his own near mistake privately, and channeled it, months later, into volunteering at a local youth center, telling teenagers exactly what small compromises can eventually cost, without ever naming names. It was, in its own small way, one more ripple from a decision Ethan never spoke of to anyone, proof that the kind of justice he believed in didn't just punish, it occasionally, quietly, gave people a second chance to become better than the worst thing they had almost done. The town council, in the months following the trial, used part of the seized assets, as ordered by the court, to establish a small emergency fund for families facing predatory loans, and asked Mrs. Patterson, of all people, to help oversee it, a woman who 18 months earlier had been too frightened to speak Marcus Doyle's name out loud in her own kitchen. She accepted, on the condition that Ethan help her review the paperwork every quarter, a request he agreed to without hesitation and without ever telling her why it meant so much to him to say yes. Lily, for her part, noticed only that her father seemed a little lighter after that strange autumn, that he laughed more easily, that he stopped checking the locks on the doors 3 times before bed the way he had for a few unsettling weeks. She never knew about Marcus Doyle, never knew about the stuffed rabbit on the kitchen table, never knew that her father had once been a very different kind of man in a very different kind of life. She only knew that her dad still made her grilled cheese cut into triangles, still picked her up at 3:15 sharp, still sat with her every night while she did her homework at the same worn kitchen table where, months earlier, he had made the quietest, most dangerous decision of his life. One evening, months after Marcus Doyle's sentencing had finally been handed down, 22 years in federal prison, restitution ordered to every family he had harmed, Ethan sat on the porch with Lily, watching the sun go down over Millbrook's quiet streets. Lily, swinging her legs off the edge of the porch step, looked up at him with the kind of unguarded curiosity only children seem capable of. "Dad," she said, "were you ever scared of anything when you were young?" Ethan thought about the question longer than she probably expected. He thought about the mission that had cost him 2 friends. He thought about the stuffed rabbit on the kitchen table. He thought about 11 minutes of terrible stillness in his own kitchen, deciding exactly how far he was willing to go for the small girl now sitting beside him. "I was scared once," he said finally, of becoming someone who stopped protecting the people who needed it. That's the only thing that ever really scared me. Lily considered this with the serious expression she reserved for things she didn't now fully understand yet but wanted to remember anyway. She didn't press further, the way children sometimes know without being told, that a question has touched something deep and fragile in the person they love most, and that the kindest thing to do is simply to let it rest there, unexamined, safe. She reached over and took her father's rough, calloused hand in her small one, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, watching the last orange light slide behind the row of maple trees at the end of their street. Then she smiled, leaned against his shoulder, and asked if they could have grilled cheese for dinner, cut into triangles, because triangles, she reminded him, tasted better than squares. And Ethan Cole, quiet mechanic, quiet father, a man who had once again proven, without a single act of visible violence, that the most dangerous people in any town are rarely the loudest ones in the room, smiled, pulled his daughter a little closer, and told her that yes, they absolutely could. The story of Millbrook's reckoning never made national news. It never needed to. It lived on quietly in the town itself, in Mrs. Patterson's community fund, in Claire Finch's testimony, in Tony Rossi's referrals, in a dozen small permanent changes that rippled outward from one father's, his decision to protect his daughter by any means necessary, without ever losing the gentleness that made him worth protecting in the first place. Marcus Doyle, from behind prison walls, would spend decades trying to understand exactly how his empire had collapsed so completely, so quickly, and would never once suspect that the answer had been standing calmly in his office, months earlier, thanking him politely for his time, because that, in the end, was the lesson this town, and this story, had to teach. That real strength rarely announces itself. It doesn't posture, doesn't threaten, doesn't need an audience. It waits, it protects, and when it finally moves, it moves with a precision that leaves no room for the world to ever underestimate it again. Somewhere out there, in towns just like Millbrook, there are quiet fathers just like Ethan Cole, ordinary in every visible way, until the day someone makes the mistake of threatening what they love most. And on that day, the world discovers, often far too late, exactly who they were dealing with all along. If this story reminded you that quiet people carry the deepest strength, and that a father's love for his child can be the most powerful force in the world, let us know in the comments what part moved you most. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories just like this one, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded today that the quietest people in the room are often the strongest ones in it. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.